thank you all for having me. I appreciate being part of OHRA. It's been amazing to see what we have done, or they have done, or we all have done in such a short time. And I want to take this direction and this conversation in a different way here and get a little bit more, I guess, up close and personal. You may know this photograph. Do you remember? This is the kids, the team that was in the cave in northern Thailand. And the whole world sort of stopped and watched as they were rescued. There was a call out for not just divers and rescue divers, but cave rescue divers from around the world to get these young people, 13 people, out of that cave. But what you may not know is that the head of the Thai Navy SEALs, who orchestrated that entire operation, said the only thing he had to work with was hope. And I thought it was interesting that both Representative Marsh, Senator Golden, both mentioned hope with regard to homelessness. And that's actually what I'm talking about today, is the science of hope and why it matters in these sorts of complex challenges that we face. A BBC reporter that covered this story also said it was the best example he'd ever seen of hope in action. Two words we don't usually put together, right? Hope and action. But I want to share some of the science of hopefulness called hope theory. And there's a great study from Gallup, you know, the guys who study everything. And they did a study where they asked leaders in the lives of thousands of people that they surveyed, what was the best thing, what was the best trait that the best leader in their life ever brought them? And they took all these words and phrases and they boiled them down to 4 words. And here's what people said the best leaders in their lives brought to them. And leadership relevant, obviously, because it is the leaders at any level. It's not a job title, it's not a corner office, it's people who are willing to step up to the plate, is what we're all talking about today. But what everybody said they wanted from their leaders, stability, right? And when I think of this in terms of underserved, homeless, needy populations, there's nothing more important than stability and safety. They said trust, right? Foundational. Trust goes both ways. I think of the navigators at OHRA who do what they do, and the trust they build with people who come in off the street, maybe never having been there before, never having trusted any sort of organized system. And they build almost immediate rapport. It's really magical. Compassion. I think Pam and Jeff both mentioned compassion, why we have to have the compassion and find that in our hearts. Not just, I talk to corporate America about this all the time, but certainly in what we're trying to do together. And finally, these thousands of people said, hope. That's the best thing that leaders can give them. They also said these other words here, direction, faith. Those are some of the things that people need from their leaders. And to me, hope has always been an important word. I'll tell you a little bit about my background in a second, but hope was sort of my internal mantra. Hope, tomorrow's going to be a better day. Choose hope, keep moving forward. Those kinds of ideas. And then later, when I became an executive coach, I had the good fortune to discover there was a body of science around hopefulness, a little bit like the happiness research you've probably heard of, Project Happiness and all that sort of thing. Not as many people are acquainted with the research around hope. It's thought to be a little abstract, a little up in the air, but I'm going to explain some of the research behind hopefulness. The word itself comes from an Old English word, hopian, which means to leap forward with expectation. That is the literal translation or derivation of that word. And that always sounded good to me. I'm working sometimes with problem organizations and executives that need help getting back on track. And to me, you can't just sort of stroll through life. You know those coasters in the world, people that just say, I'll just take it as it comes? I've never been one of those. I was a kid in junior high carrying a filofax, if you remember what that is. I was always a planner. But this really resonated with me, this idea that you're going to leap into the situation expecting an outcome, a positive outcome, to be better off today than you are, or tomorrow than you are today. And so when I really studied up and looked at the science of hope, There are two key pioneers that really brought this research forward. And the first one is this fellow here, Dr. Rick Snyder. He was a positive psychologist, a professor at the University of Kansas. He wrote this book, The Psychology of Hope. It's one of those big, dry textbooks, but really fascinating. And he said hope really boils down to the willpower, the will to do it, to make something happen, to drive an outcome. And then this I thought was really interesting. It's also the way power, meaning how do you find your way to that end goal? And just like in today's business world, we don't work by speeding up the assembly line anymore. We work with ideas, information, imagination. So there are typically multiple ways, pathways, to get to an end goal. And that's what Dr. Snyder said. He'd actually started this research because when he was on sabbatical from teaching at U of K, he decided he'd go to the library and find out all the data and the research, the hard science about hope, only to discover there was none. And like any good social scientist, he realized people had thought, well, you can't measure hope, so how can there be any data? So he created a scale. Happy to give it to anybody that wants it. You can just send me an email. I'll share that with you and just write Hope Quiz. It's 12 questions that he called the Adult Dispositional Hope Scale. And it's simply how much agency do you feel that you have? Do you have control? Can you solve problems? Can you move forward even in times of adversity? And that's what Dr. Snyder, you're nodding. Yes, you understand that, having hope. And then another fellow came along, Dr. Jerome Groopman. He is a Harvard-trained oncologist. And when he was a young physician, clinician, giving diagnoses to his patients and his patient families, he thought early on in his career that the most important thing he could do was give all the information he possibly had at his disposal to his patients. Now you can imagine in the world of cancer, oncology, that is a lot of information. And what he discovered is his patients were shutting down in sheer overwhelm. They couldn't take it all in. They couldn't handle that much information. So he did what we sometimes do. He went all the way in the other direction and started giving them a very limited amount of information and realized that was also not the solution. People were it was like he was handing them the rose-colored glasses. And people were thinking, oh, okay, well, this won't be so hard. Also not accurate. And he realized he was giving them a sense of what he came to call false hope. And then he found that spot right in the middle that he called true hope, which is a recognition, there's a vision of the future of where we can get to, especially if we work together, but also a recognition that it isn't always going to be easy. That if you set the bar high enough, you're going to have pitfalls and problems along the way, and that's part of the process. And that to him was true hope. And he found when he gave that balance to people, and it's not unlike the problems we're trying to solve, that you want to see a better vision of the future, but you've got to recognize it's going to be a lot of bumps along the way to get there. And Dr. Groopman boiled it down to say it's a belief that change is possible. Fundamental. If you don't believe change is possible, then you might as well pack up and go home, because you've got to have that fundamental belief. But it's also an expectation that what you do as an individual is what actually drives the outcome. It's not the team, it's not your boss, it's not the government, it's not your spouse. It is what you do and how you take action. Now you take a group of people with the same vision of the future, moving in the same direction, and they are unstoppable. I mean, we can solve these problems together. I see hope as having this vision of the future that is fueled by passion, but it's grounded in pragmatism. And to me, even though I talk about this to corporate executives and people like that all the time, it had a direct correlation to what we're doing here, trying to solve big, complex problems. And folks who are high hope people who score high on that test, which Dr. Snyder gave to thousands of people, have some things in common. And I would say you were all high hope people, or why would you be here? We have the belief that we can do more together. We tend to set more goals, unlike the coasters, and God bless them, people that coast along and take life as it comes. Good for them, never worked for me. But we set more goals than low hope people. We set more ambitious goals. We're putting the bar right up here. We're not doing it the easy way. We believe we can do more. We have more success than reaching our goals, and I think that's because we have the perseverance. We recognize that it's not going to be easy getting there, wherever there is, but we're willing to go the distance. And finally, we have more satisfaction. We have less stress doing this together. I think we have more joy. We're not as lonely. It's much more satisfying when you bring a group of people, even with disparate opinions, bring a group of people together and move toward that common goal, which clearly we all have a goal of solving homelessness in this country, certainly this state and this county. I want to share a little bit about how I came at this whole idea of hope. I've written a book about leaders, the hope-driven leader, and really studied the difference between companies that really take this idea and build it in, this future-focused vision of, I see it, and we can get there if we work towards it together with an eye on, yeah, we'll have problems and challenges to solve. These are my siblings. This is as close as my family ever got to a family photo, which probably says something right there. That's me, down in the one with the bow. A fashionista at age 5, I was. And I grew up in Jacksonville, not Oregon, but Jacksonville, Florida, a little town outside of Jacksonville. Very rural, very pretty, on the St. Johns River, not unlike the valley here, except, we didn't know what a hill was. I thought if somebody's driveway was on a 1-foot incline, they were living up on a mountainside. So other than that, it was very similar. Big family, obviously, 6 kids. My dad was a well-known local doctor. And everything seemed, pretty terrific in our young lives until Christmas Day when I was 10 years old. And at that time, we all came running into the kitchen, find the parents, open the presents, get on with the day, only to discover there was a neighbor sitting at the kitchen table. And even when you're 10 years old, you know that that is not a good sign. And it turned out my oldest brother, David, who was on his freshman break home from Princeton on his Christmas break, had gone to a party the night before and gotten into a car accident, and my parents were at the hospital with him. I found out much later that my dad had told my brother that he was about to divorce my mother, his wife of 23 years and 6 children, and to marry his patient. My dad was a psychiatrist, by the way. And leaving to marry a psychiatric patient in a small town in the South. As you can imagine, that did not go over well. We were well known, but not for great things in our community. And so my brother actually died that day. And yeah, it was a sad day. And then our family sort of fell apart as well. We lost our home and our schools. And then my dad moved to Japan with his new family. And I spent my adolescence going back and forth from Jacksonville to Japan visiting, and eventually moved there. And then finally we came back and settled in Southern California. My dad and stepmom moved back to Florida, and I decided by then, I'd gone to 6 high schools, including 2 in my senior year. Wherever it was, I was staying put. I got a job. I got an apartment. I grew up at about age 17, and I put myself through college. And knocked around Hollywood for a while trying to get that big first job, and I finally landed it, working in a public relations department of a very prestigious television company. If you're my age and a TV nut, you might recognize the name Norman Lear, but that was the guy that owned the company. And so the day I was supposed to start that new job, I get a call from my dad that my stepmother, Fran, has taken an overdose of pills and alcohol and died in the guest room while he was asleep in the bedroom. So I dutifully packed up and told my boss I'll have to wait a week before I start the new job, flew home to Florida, took care of my dad, who was descending into alcoholism, cleaned out the house, packed up all her clothes, planned a funeral. My dad had disowned all the other siblings. We were a troubled family, so it was just me. And I gave all her beautiful clothes away except for the one thing my dad insisted that I take with me. And that was my stepmom, Fran's, full-length mink coat with a little matching hood. And here I am, not even 30, living in a little dark apartment in this middle Hollywood, trying to make a living, thinking, what the heck? am I supposed to do with this? But trying to be a good daughter, I took it, flew home, started my job, and I just worked. And I worked and worked and worked, thinking, that's the solution for grief and despair. If you just put your head down and work, it'll just go away. Until one day I thought, well, that's not working too well. So like maybe not a young person's solution, I went into the kitchen, found a bottle of booze from some long ago, muffin recipe or something. I was not a big drinker back then. And so I poured a glass of brandy, and then I drank it down, and I had this idea, and I thought, I have never tried on that coat. So I took my glass and my bottle, and I took myself into the bedroom, opened the closet, took out that mink coat. Not only had I not tried on that coat, I had never tried on anything remotely like a fur in my entire life. But now seemed to be the time. So I put that thing on, and all I could think was how heavy and decadent and luxurious it felt. And I thought, how many dead animals must it have taken to make this one coat for my poor, sad stepmother? And that thought just kind of slayed me, and I just went right down to my knees, crawled into the hallway, I kid you not, and stayed for a good 24 hours, drinking my brandy, crying my eyes out, wrapped in my coat. And finally I thought, you can only stay down here so long. And the minute I thought that, I swear to you, it was like arms coming through the mink coat sleeves. And I got up, and I heard this, get up off the floor, it's time. And I thought, I can't continue to feel self-pity and feel sorry for myself. Yeah, it was tough, but a lot of people had it a lot worse than I did. And in that second, I heard this voice, and I don't know if you've ever experienced this, whatever you call it, but it just rang in my head so clearly, hope and tools, hope and tools. And I spent the next couple of decades thinking, what does that mean exactly? And then later on, as I was a corporate boss and then executive coaching, it really became clear to me it's about providing that vision of the future, the possibility that you can get there, and the right resources at the right time. And when I look at OHRA and all of you that do the work that you do, to me, that's what you do. You give people a vision of the future, of a better future, and the tools and resources to get there. And I think that's the most important work that you're all doing in all your different ways. Even just by being in this room, you are part of the solution. And this takes me to my other brother, my youngest brother, Cameron. Now, Cameron has a master's in English. He was a 25-year community college teacher, a former homeowner. He's schizophrenic and bipolar. Talk about the double whammy of mental illness, he's got it. He has, in the last 7 years since I've been his power of attorney and his guardian, he's been in and out of shelters, jail, assisted living facilities, apartments, and psychiatric hospitals. And when I thought, I'll tell a little bit about this story, and maybe just put a little human face on it, not that you don't already have your own pictures. You walk down the street and see homeless people. Just last week, he's been off his medication for a couple years and, ranting and crazy. I've been in Zoom court with him, and he swears I'm not his sister, I'm not his POA. And then he checked himself into a hospital and got back on his meds, and he's taking now the long LIAs, long something injections, long lasting, that'll last him for a month. And he did that voluntarily. And then they were able to place him in a group home. And I gotta say, sometimes, and he's in Florida, he's not in Oregon. If he were, I'd send him right over to OHRA, but he's still in Jacksonville, Florida. But they were able to place him in the psychiatric hospital. First time, in my experience, sometimes you find these wonderful, caring, professional people, and other times you're totally on your own, or at least that's been my experience. And it takes hours. And I don't know how anybody becomes a navigator without an organization or an agency behind them. I've spent so many hours on Social Security and banking and all of that. It's just what you do to be a navigator. But he got back on his meds. He got into that group home. He left in 48 hours because he didn't like their rules. And he is now on the street. But he took himself back to the hospital and signed up for outpatient care. And that, to me, was a great sign to continue on his meds. And now we're looking for a home. We're looking for one of those SROs, a room in a house, an inexpensive apartment, and you all know how hard that is. I don't know if it's harder in Florida than it is in Oregon. Maybe you all know, but it certainly isn't easy. But every now and then I get this glimpse of the guy he used to be, this smart, sweet, funny guy. And when he says to me, which he does just about daily, he says, "You're an angel. Don't give up on me. I just know I never will." And I think all of you that are doing the same thing and not giving up on what can be a very difficult population to work with at times. But as the Roman statesman Cicero said, or Sam the Hobbit, or another dozen people attributed to this quote, probably because it's so true, where there's life, there's hope. As long as somebody's upright, we can help them. And I think that about my brother, and I think that about all the work that you're doing. It comes down to really having this growth mindset of we can take risks, we can fail, we can try again. It's the folks with this growth mindset versus the fixed, and you've all heard that term. It actually came from a psychologist at Stanford, Dr. Carol Dweck, who was studying elementary education and looking at what made some kids struggle and some kids succeed. And you'll see the kinds of traits. It's not very different than the grown-ups we see today. You don't have to be a kid. Some of us will take risks. Some of us will take criticism. Others struggle with that. I'm going to just do what I do. Well, of course, everybody in this room has got to have a growth mindset because we are moving towards innovating. As Jeff said, and Pam said, we've got to make some changes. We've got to look at things differently. And that's happening here, which I'm glad to say. Sometimes it comes from the youngest people around us that give us this sense of hope and these innovations. And this young woman is named Katie Stagliano, who I had the good luck to meet when I interviewed her for one of my books. And Katie was 9 years old when she found sort of a groundbreaking idea. She was in 3rd grade. They sent her home from an extracurricular class with a cabbage seed. She thought, okay, I will plant that seed. She planted it. It started to grow. She got really interested. And then when she discovered that cabbage grew to 40 pounds, just about as big as little 9-year-old Katie, her mother in her wisdom said, gee, what should we do with this? And they decided they would give it to a soup kitchen. Now, Katie's a kid. She didn't know they had those sorts of things, or homeless shelters, or anything like that in her community, but they did. And when she found out that cabbage in the form of cabbage soup fed 270 people, that was it. She was on fire. Like a kid, she was so excited. So she took her garden and planted it at her middle school. Then she started other kids planting gardens. She now has a 501c3 nonprofit. She has kids in 30 states, hundreds of gardens at this point, donating thousands of pounds of produce to shelters and soup kitchens and pantries all across the United States. And my thought is, wow, if a little kid with one cabbage seed could do that, what can the rest of us do with our smarts and our resources and everything at our disposal, particularly if we join in? And as I'm understanding it, this is the first time all of these great agencies and people have really been in the same room. And I know you're all connected to each other, but to figure out how do we solve this together so that we can actually end homelessness? I think that might be a possibility. And although I've never ended a keynote presentation with a poem before, this seems sort of fitting today, and it's Emily Dickinson's poem 254, which you might know by a different name, which is the first line. Hope is the thing with feathers that perches in the soul and sings the tune without the words and never stops at all. And sweetest is the gale is heard, and sore must be the storm that could abash the little bird that kept so many warm. I've heard it in the chillest land and on the strangest sea, yet never in extremity it asked a crumb of me. That's the thing about hope. All it asks is that you keep it alive. Thank you very much.